Hello, everyone. Let me start by introducing the person sitting next to me. Michael Beutler is the Director of Sustainability Operations at Kering, a group of luxury sports and lifestyle brands such as Gucci, Alexander McQueen, Bottega Veneta, Saint Laurent, Stella McCartney, Puma, and others. He has been integral to operationalizing Kering's sustainability strategies, and he oversees a team to implement those innovative approaches to help manage and reduce the environmental impacts from Kering's brands. Did I say that right?
You did, perfectly.
Okay. So, Kering was the first and so far only luxury group to launch an EPNL, or an environmental profit and loss report. Could you explain what it is and why it is such a big deal in the industry?
Okay, so I think one way of looking at the environmental profit and loss is to ask the question, where does everything we're wearing in this room come from? And we ask, where did it come from? How's it made? What's the impact of that? And then, of course, from there, we can figure out where to focus our energy. So to do that, we mapped our entire supply chain. We looked at over 100 different materials that we use, and this is from everything from luxury, sports and lifestyle, jewelry, and watches. Over 600 production processes, and as well 5,000 suppliers. And we looked at that over 126 countries, because when you start peeling back the layers of your supply chain, it's a global supply chain. Even if it's silk from China, even if it's lamb from the Middle East, wool, still you have to consider all the other bits and pieces that go into, whether it's zippers, whether it's buttons. There's long, long supply chains that help provide us that. So we looked at all that, and then not only did we understand the footprint of our business, but we also did something a little further. We assigned a value to it. So we said, if we were to write a check to nature for all these things we're using, how much would that check be? And then we did the next thing, which was to publish that. And the reason we did that is to urge not only other businesses in our industry, other fashion brands, other luxury, other sports, but also beyond. And there are other companies now that are doing similar things.
Yeah, so why did you decide to open source that EPNL methodology? Doesn't it give you a competitive edge if you don't?
It does, in that we now know where to focus our energy, but there's also issues like cashmere. And cashmere is a good example, because with cashmere, it takes a lot of hairs from goats to make, let's say, one sweater. And the goats use a lot of land. And so when the demand for cashmere grew over the last 15 years, the stress on the land grew so much that the Chinese government actually had grazing restrictions. So that's a real thing that affects our industry. Now, we're looking at introducing more sustainable grazing practices and different things on the ground in Mongolia, but at the same time, it can't be just us alone. It's the industry needs to collaborate. And whether it's that or heavy metal-free tanning or other things that are key for our industry, collaboration really has to be the key for longer-term solutions.
Now, one of the things Kering emphasizes is that this is not out of some ideal to save the world. It actually makes good business sense to do this. Why is that so important?
In luxury, we want really high-quality materials. We want to have those fabrics. We want to have, whether it's soft leather, whatever it is. And to get those materials today is not easy. It's for instance, to recreate a silk collection that was done in the 1960s recently was very difficult, because finding that same quality of silk, it's very rare now. So it's also, in a sense, insurance for our industry to continue. So there's a selfish aspect, which is to make sure that luxury can continue to have high quality products to provide to our customers, but also because we do believe that unless we act together, we're not going to solve the problem. Whether we're looking at COP21 in Paris, which is going on right now, they're global scale problems. So companies need to come forward with solutions.
Now, on the one hand, you try to sell things. On the other hand, you try to reduce your environmental footprint. Are those two even compatible?
For luxury, I think there's something to be said for quality and long-lasting, making something that actually can last a long time. For instance, I have a pair of shoes that's over 12 years old. And the difference, I think, between, it's easier to say for luxury than fast fashion, because in luxury, quality and longevity is a key part of it. Also preserving industries and artisanal, handcrafted skills is part of that as well. These are things that aren't so much a matter of scale, but a matter of, in some cases, even exclusivity. But I think the important thing is that sustainability is sort of inherent to quality. So we don't see a conflict between those two things.
Now, what were the most important or remarkable conclusions from that first EP&L report?
What was interesting about that is, and I'll try not to speak too much in the language of the EP&L, but to introduce you to it, we have different tiers of our production. Like we have our operation, which is our stores, our warehouses. And then we call that tier 0. Then we have tier 4, which is like the raw materials. That's a farm, that's a mine for gold. And then there's tier 3 that takes those things and makes them into like refining metal and can be like spinning, weaving, things you do to make thread. And what we found is that only 7% of our impacts were in our operations. Now, most businesses, when they look around, you think, oh, we change some lights, we do, that's important. But for us, only 7% was there. The real impacts were in the part that historically the industry has thought about the least, which is the sourcing. And that, there were 50% of the impacts. And when I say impacts, we look at greenhouse gas, we look at water, we look at waste, we look at the land use, how the land changes. We also look at water pollution, water quality, and air quality. So we're looking at everything, like the whole picture. And 50% of those impacts were in the part that historically we knew the least about, and as an industry we know the least about. Another 25% in that conversion of those raw materials. So 75% of the footprint is the part furthest away from, I'll say, the traditional control of our supply chains.
Did that surprise you?
That was a surprise for many people, because we don't think in the terms of, when you put on a jacket in a store, you're not thinking about, well, where did that come from? Where was this, where was the wool, where were the lambs raised? How much water did they use? We look at the design, we look at how it feels, and gathering that awareness in our business, and of course, that also is for consumers too. But gathering that awareness was, I think, an awakening. And once you start thinking that way, you can't really go back. So, in a sense, that for our brands to embrace that way of thinking also is a change in itself.
And what actions did you take based on those conclusions?
So there's a lot of things we've done, and I'll just name a few. Some innovations, such as I said, heavy metal-free tanning. We did one of the largest buys of ethically sourced gold. The water pollution in gold can be significant. We've projects on the ground, as I said, with cashmere, with silk, for instance. One of the technologies was mentioned earlier today in terms of closed-loop recycling, worn again, and looking for those kind of technology investments. And also it reaffirmed that some of the things that we're doing, the ways we source leather and luxury, some of the sourcing is actually quite good. And so we also knew where not to focus. For instance, we have a cycle with calf leather coming from northern France, which is one of the more sustainable areas of the world, versus other kinds of leather where we said, okay, we need to focus on looking at better sourcing, looking for more reliable. So when we talk about why do it as a business, because if it has a heavy impact, it's not gonna sustain. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is climate change, how that's going to impact, because as we're talking about scenarios in Paris about it, as weather patterns are shifting, it affects the raw materials that everyone in this room uses, and being aware of that is important. So there's an awareness in terms of continuing sourcing practice. There's some where we have to change them, and there's some where we invest in innovation. But knowing where to do that is what I think the difference is. Instead of, oh, well, here's a cool project, let's go do that. We look at the impact and say, okay, well, here's the ones with the biggest impact where we can have make the most progress. Let's put our efforts in this.
And are the changes you made still in the testing phase? Or?
We've implemented, for instance, as I said, heavy metal-free tanning. We don't always advertise it because it's up to each of our brands and their own identity, what works for them. Some of our brands don't talk about what they do. They let their design speak for themselves. Others are much more vocal about sustainability.
Why is that? Why do you talk about it with some brands and you don't with others?
Well, we allow freedom within a framework, so each brand has its own identity. And even though brands may do some very sustainable things, they may not, as part of their branding, their core branding, want to address that. Others, and I'll name two off the bat, Stella McCartney, and then we recently launched with Kelly Slater, Outer Known, which we're helping support. They're more marketing on sustainability, but more important is how we build it into the actual products themselves. And what our CEO has said, François-Henri Pinault, is that we're not doing it to sell more bags or sell more product. We're doing it because we actually believe it's the right thing for the business. Now, eventually, we think it will be translated in consumer terms. But for now, that's not the motivation to do it. It's to do it because, as I said, we have an interest in that to keep our business going. And also because we believe it's the right thing to do.
And like Tom said, because you still want to be selling bags in like 50 to 100 years.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the group's environmental impact in 2013 was estimated to be 776 million euro. And in 2014, that number went up to 793 million euro. How come that number went up, considering all the changes you've already made?
So our business growth was about 4.5% in comparative terms. Our financial people tell me this, I have to say that. And our EP&L growth, so the size of our footprint grew about 2.2%. So actually there's a net difference of doing that there's actually a bit of reduction relative to growth. So that's what we're trying to do, is create a trajectory for our footprint growing less or decreasing relative to our increase in revenue. And the other thing we're looking at, when I talk about footprint, there are some instances where we found opportunities to actually improve ecosystems, improve the environment, and we can have positive outcomes. In a sense, a benefit or profit, environmental profit and loss. And that's much more difficult to find those opportunities, but we also, it doesn't always have to be this huge footprint, but the state of affairs today for most industries in the world is it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't have COP21 and the realization that we need to do, so we need to act.
And what are your long-term targets?
I'm sorry?
What are your long-term targets?
Our long-term targets are, we've set targets to achieve in 2016, which include sustainable sourcing of raw materials, and we'll be actually announcing those results later next year. But long-term, I think it's really about innovation. It's not just around, traditionally companies in sustainability set targets, whether they're in apparel, if they're oil and gas, if they're like a Unilever, or they'd set traditional targets around reducing consumption of water, waste, greenhouse gas, which we did as well. But I think the real question now is how do you be more disruptive in terms of what you're achieving? Because that approach to achieving, at least from a corporate standpoint, obviously hasn't been really successful. And when we look at things like COP21 that are going to set probably real global limits on things, I think it's up to businesses not only to be transparent about their performance, but also to really start to measure innovation. So I think we'll start to explore more that area than just conventional targets.
Now, if a company is looking to improve its environmental footprint, where should they start?
I think anyone, no matter what industry you're in, but especially in apparel, you need to know where your stuff comes from. If you're going to a supplier and they're saying, well, we get the material from wherever, from Italy, dig a little deeper. Find out where it comes from. Find out what processes are used. It's not easy, and we hope to help you. We've shared some of our methodology already as part of our open sourcing, but this spring we're going to share even more in terms of how to calculate footprints to give multipliers that you can say for instance, for a handbag, what is the footprint of a leather handbag on average? So that's the kind of thing we hope to empower other people to do. There's many different organizations that are now getting on board with that. There's the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. There's others that are helping, I'll say, fuel that movement. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really important to understand basically what it is you're doing. So where does it come from and how's it made? And that's a huge, from there, it's just getting more information to help quantify that. But that first step is a big, big step.
Mm-hmm. What impact does the current fashion calendar with 4 to 6 collections a year have on the environment?
Actually, I'm going to probably shock everyone. I actually don't think the fashion calendar, everyone wants to focus on that, all the materials wasted for the shows and all that. It's not that. It's, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not a lot of the impact. What's interesting about the fashion shows, for larger brands, if they have 250, 300 looks, what actually goes into production is a lot less. Maybe it's 100. What's actually out in the retail floor could, depending on the market, maybe only 50 to 70. So if you focus all your attention on sustainable materials and design process, and maybe a certain part of your collection is, you don't actually know what's going to prove out. So where we've focused, one, we have a materials library to offer those sustainable material choices. So we've set that up in Italy to help support the design and material developers. But the other thing we've tried to do is try to, in a way, orchestrate supply chains so you can have sustainable wool available. You can have cotton. Mm-hmm. Keeping in mind that the growing season and the fashion season have to come together, so it takes a little time to do that. But if you have a beautiful fabric, it can be made out of sustainable material or it can be made out of conventional cotton. When I used to think of sustainable cotton or organic cotton, you think of kind of brownish, rough. It can be as beautiful as any cotton out there. Silk, wool, and sometimes even more, even a higher quality, depending on what it is. But I think it's important it's very, very important that we have not only those materials available for creativity, but also within a supply chain that when the choice is made to go into production, there's a sustainable option.
But 6 collections a year, it's not just showing those collections. You also have to produce them. And that has a big impact on what you do.
It does, but it does have some impact. And I think fast fashion, it's a lot more the waste from those collections, which you don't have quite as much in luxury. So luxury, it's a little different. I think it's important, and there's lots of questions about the fashion cycle. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that if you orchestrate supply chains that can provide sustainable materials, and if you have sustainable options that go into production, it can at least mitigate a lot of that. And I think we focus on that because that's what we see. When I came to this industry, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe all these, it's so wasteful, flying stuff back and forth, look at the footprint. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, it's actually not as much as you'd think.
And do you believe that sustainability should be taken into account in the earliest stage, meaning the design stage?
Well, and I'll highlight brands like Outerknown where we're looking at it when they're even launching the brand. So if you're really going to do it, from the beginning, and if you're a new designer, I would say, if you have values around sustainability, make sure that those values stay true in your brand, which is difficult in any kind of creative endeavor, whether it's music, or if it's, we had a rock star before, earlier today, whether it's music, whether it's art, film, doesn't matter. But to stay true to your values is really important. And I think also when you're launching your brand, think about, how you're going to do business. And, what kind of statement you make by what you do every day, not just your marketing. Because your marketing will only get you so far. And in this day and age, authenticity is really important, not just to millennials, but I think it's growing importance to all generations. So it's really important you stay true to whatever your vision is.
And what are the most important challenges that the fashion industry is facing today?
Collaboration. I think there's a big opportunity to collaborate more, to innovate.
Collaborating with who?
With each other, with other industries. I'll take an example like leather. Depending on how you calculate it, 9% of the economic impact is from the leather we use for products, but the rest is for meat. So if we're looking at more, and we can argue the values of whether to use leather or not, but the fact of the matter in the industry, we do. And if we're going to do that, we need to collaborate with other industries. And it's not just the cattle raising, but also the feed industry. You have to go back in the supply chain, and that takes a scale of collaboration. For ethical gold, we're not a huge player in the gold market. We're very small, in fact, fractions of a percent. But it's important for us to have sustainable options, whether it's gold, diamonds, that are ethically mined. So that takes partnering beyond our own industry with others, with our peers, and going to other industries to look for solutions. Mm-hmm. In fact, when we look at our supply chains, we depend on almost every industry in one way or another, because we're, whether it's logistics and transportation, whether it's mining, even if you're not doing jewelry, but you have zippers and buttons. Plastic, if you have any sort of synthetic, that's petroleum industry. So there's synergies and opportunities in all those to take advantage of new innovations and new technologies to do things in a more sustainable way.
You talked about it already, but the United Nations Climate Change Conference is happening right now in Paris. How can the fashion industry play a role in helping to change its unsustainable paradigm?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting question about COP21. And the fashion industry definitely plays a role because we're what people touch and feel. We're not, although I've seen statistics saying that we're the second most polluting, it's arguable, because I've seen other statistics that say otherwise. But what we are is something like food. People eat food, they take it in their body. Cosmetics, they put it on. Clothing we wear. And clothing is something that's emblematic of what sustainability is on a broader scale in our lives. So I think things we can do to help consumers, to help people understand better something tangible to them, the clothes they wear, and what sustainable means, and what the footprint is, and how it works. It's like when we go in a grocery store, we don't really know, maybe don't want to know, where the food comes from. But more and more people are asking those questions. I think we need to be ready and understand ourselves those answers for our industry. And the COP21, whatever goals are set, the tough part is going to be implementing them, and that's where our industry can rise to the challenge.
Do you also believe that you have to be more transparent about where the clothes you make come from? Like, should it be in the label, like this is made over there, that is made over there? And
the made in is really interesting. A lot of times it's not the country requirements. I forget what it is for like Swiss watches, and it's similar, made in USA. Sometimes like 51%, or they have like real complicated rules. But I think it's very important to be transparent. I think for us it's paid off because we really do make things in Italy. I've seen the factories, and it's not just because of habit. It's because there's a craftsmanship and there's a tradition there that you don't get anywhere else. But I think it's very important for brands because that's part of the value that consumers expect. If they pay a premium for luxury, they expect to be made in a better way and in a sustainable way. And we need to continue to deliver on those values.
Okay, I think our time is up. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, everybody.